Hello there, I'm Reverend Nhien, founder of Evolving Enneagram. If you've been seeking a compassion-based, contemplative approach to Enneagram inner work, you are certainly in the right place. We are in week 26 of a 52-week Sunday talk series based on the book by Oren Sofer, Your Heart Was Made for This. And week 26, we're actually smack in the middle, halfway through. I'd like to take a moment to celebrate the fact that I've been consistent every week since the beginning of the year, and that's a big deal for me. For those of you who are familiar with being self-preservation blind, routine and regularity are not normally my jam, and so it's a big deal and a moment to celebrate, especially since this is also the last week of our 4 contemplative practices and the Enneagram groups before we break for our summer break and then start again in the fall. So if you've been watching these videos and feel called to join one of our contemplative Enneagram groups, this summer would be the time to sign up for the fall, which begins the week of September 17th. Also, during the summer, you might want to join our book journey. Again, these talks are based on this book, and all the details will be in the show notes, if you will, for this. So you can join the book journey at any time. And this week, we are focused on the topic of empathy. So I want to start just by saying that most of us have had at least one occasion in our lives, an experience of like significant and genuine empathy, whether it's from a teacher, a therapist, a minister, a parent, if we're super lucky, or a friend, one of those friends who gets it. For some of us, maybe it was actually a stranger or an acquaintance who happened to just be in the right place at the right time during our breakdown, if you will. And perhaps this experience happened when you were in a time of profound grief, or you were feeling just particularly scared or anxious, or it was a time of just this like intense frustration or rage or despair, perhaps over the injustice happening in your life or in our world, and there's plenty to choose from there. Maybe it was just like this experience of darkness. I know for me, there was a phase where it just felt like a hollowing out, like I was just numb, and yeah, it felt more hollow than anything else, like I was the inside of a tree trunk that had been hollowed out. So perhaps during this time, this person who showed up for you, maybe this group of people, did not try to fix you, didn't jump in and offer unsolicited solutions or advice to you. And they didn't try to get you to look on the bright side, nor did they look down on you, in pity. Rather, it was more like the sense that they were with you, in your particular challenge or darkness. And, the famous vulnerability researcher Brene Brown makes a distinction between empathy and sympathy. And I want to talk about this as we come into this space where we're exploring empathy. Sympathy, she describes, is like when we feel for someone, like, aw, poor you. And empathy, the distinction she makes is that we are feeling with someone, or in this case, someone was feeling with you, being with you, companioning you. In the book Atlas of the Heart, which shout out to our Evolving Enneagram Adjunct faculty, Angela Joy. She did a book study for us a couple years back. And this book is by Brene Brown. She writes the difference between empathy and sympathy, feeling with and feeling for. The empathic response, I get it. I feel with you. I've been there. And the sympathetic response, I feel sorry for you, right? So we can feel the difference of what that experience is like when we had genuine empathy. And you might even remember a time when someone expressed sympathy for you, and how that can stir up feelings of being looked down upon, and feeling even some sense of disempowerment as a result of that, rather than inspired, supported, or uplifted. So in the last 2 weeks in these Sunday talks, we've been talking about the need to resource ourselves in order to open up to transformation and to heal from our reactivity. And this compassionate approach to inner work is not about duking it out with ourselves, efforting our way into transformation, but really allowing the natural propensity that we have toward healing and restoration and integration and wholeness to occur through our own holding of compassionate and related to compassion, well-resourced space within ourselves and our lives. So with this, I would like to say that for me, empathy is a resource that can support a traumatized world, enabling us to move together through our collective as well as individual grief and anger and anxiety and frustration and even despair. So this is so important, the need for empathy within ourselves, our own lives, and the world. So this week in his book, Sofer asks us to imagine the following. And this quote is from his book. What kind of world could we create if empathy were woven into the fabric of our society and the core curricula of our schools? How would our justice system, immigration policy, and policing look if restructured with empathy as a core value and guiding principle? How would an economy built on empathy function? How could we redirect international resources currently spent on war, he writes, if empathy were our guide? I want to create open space for whatever your perspective, your answer to that is. And I also don't think that empathy is the only thing that we need, right? Yet at the same time, I believe that before we can act in caring and compassionate ways globally, our hearts need to not just feel for, I mean, that's one helpful step perhaps, but to feel with the suffering of others, and in particular, others who might not look or act anything like us, so we say. And for some of us, some of the Enneagram types across the circle of the Enneagram can be like foreign nations to us, or their behaviors and their customs of that Enneagram type are very strange and foreign feeling to us, right? And so this is an invitation on both levels to kind of look at that which we quote other in the world and to consider a path of practicing empathy to offer the collective field, including ourselves, a resource for healing. So remembering an experience of empathy that helped your nervous system to relax and integrate and calm to a place where you became more empowered to show up. You can just think about how if you were judged, if you were condemned, if you were shamed for what you were experiencing, how much harder it would have been for you to move forward into more healing and even into right action, into growth, right? Let's consider that when we think about the call to show up more empathetically with others in the world. Again, never neglecting ourselves, but including ourselves in that picture. So let's start by just going around the Enneagram circle, right? And you might see that if you're challenged to be empathetic with certain politics or certain races or certain religious groups in the world, that there might be Enneagram themes in what you tend to judge, what you tend to other and reject. So with that, let's begin with Enneagram type 1. And so the invitation is to basically sit in the chair or sit. If you can't sit in the chair or seat of that type, try sitting side by side with that type. Like you're kind of like, okay, I can't totally relate to you, but I'll sit over here and kind of look at things from your angle, if you will. Imagine from a heart place that you have a basic or core fear that if you don't stay self-controlled, the world will fall into badness and chaos, right? So if this is the case, it makes sense that you would be on the more critical side, right? According to others, there would be some righteousness or uptightness, this emphasis on rules or order or responsibility. And from those of us who are just sitting here side by side with the one, we might empathetically feel into the exhaustion and suffering of that sense of overburden and over responsibility that the one takes on for somehow keeping the world in order. We're not saying we agree that this is true. And in fact, if you're a type 1 and you've been on this journey, even you don't agree from your conscious mind that this is true. But there are unconscious fears that can still be operating. So sitting side by side with the Enneagram 2, I know for me, I've personally struggled when I have felt like the 2 was being in a place of like sacrificial superiority or being manipulative in some way around trying to get their needs met. And I've been able to open my heart when I could really feel into their core fear of being unworthy of being loved, and I'll remind you that when we're talking about empathy, remember, not sympathy, what we're doing is connecting to that part of ourselves. So there's some part of ourselves, even like when we go back to the 1, that feels like we have to control the order of the world, right? And with type 2s, there's some part of ourselves that fears being unworthy of getting our needs met. And so we may not frame it. Those who aren't heart types don't always frame it as fear of not being lovable. They might fear that they're unworthy to get their security needs met, right? That there's a ground of being for them, but we can feel into that sort of unworthiness in a way that allows us to really hold with empathy another person's fear of unworthiness. And that's the invitation here. We're not doing it from the outside looking in. We're going to the humanity within ourselves that contains all the universal fears and concerns that relate to just being human on this earth, right? So for the 3, when I might be struggling with the 3 seeming to be, what's the word? When I struggle with other 3s, it's that they feel impatient to me. They feel like, oh, I got to hurry and talk to them quickly or something, just like I'm another task, kind of. I can breathe into that and really feel how the 3 has this fear of being unworthy by its innate nature, just by pure being versus by its doing, like believes that it has to earn its worth. And so, of course, if your life depends on doing the deeds, the continual list of deeds that will earn your value in the world, you got to move on, right? Just feeling into that, fear, sitting side by side with that. If I can't fully relate right away yet, if you're in that place where you can't totally relate, just sit side by side with it. So for the 4, it's the fear of being without a personal identity or personal significance, and from the outside, we might judge the 4 as being overly self-indulgent or moody or depressing or overly self-referencing. But imagine, if I needed to kind of grab on this evidence of like me and what's not me in order to even feel like I have a place in the world, then it makes sense that I'm thinking, even when it's like your problem, I'm thinking about how it relates to me. That would make sense, right? And see if our heart can feel the ways that we might do that, make things about us, right? Relate it to us in some way, or feel the need for personal significance in some way, right? And so for the 5, there's this fear of, I'll say I tend to judge the 5 sometimes as being a little bit arrogant or dismissive of anything that is not intellectual, or even like arrogant in their intellectual superiority, or having some disdain for those who aren't in that sphere, that there's a deep fear of being useless, incapable, or incompetent. And also something of being overwhelmed by the world. And so, like I can feel with the 5 in that striving to kind of stay apart, to not be overwhelmed by the world, to feel like I have to gather enough resources somehow to meet the demands of life and of the world, and so feeling into that part of me that relates to that is important. For the 6 has this fear of being without support or guidance, unable to survive on its own. And I know that I have historically sort of like stood apart from that, of going, why do they worry so much? Or why are they so negative about this? And I've struggled with that from the outside, or even from that pity mode of, it's so sad to be like that. And there's something about my own journey moving from the 3 to the 6 and owning my own fears, kind of that has actually, again, by owning it in myself, that I have sought guidance all my life. I mean, I've gone to like astrologers and key points to be like, help me, right? And imagine if like I can connect with that, and imagine if that's more of like my everyday life, what that might feel like, and so I can feel with that. And if that's my stance in the world, the six's behavior makes total sense, right? But until I could really own my own fears, again, this is where empathy is about being with. It's not like from the outside going, oh, I'm not afraid like that, but for you, it's really like each of us tapping into something we've rejected or repressed unconsciously within ourselves. So yeah, feeling into that and allowing that to be part of my human experience, and having deeper empathy for how that shows up in others. So for the seven, the fear of being in pain or being limited is so powerful. And, historically, I might have been a little judgy of like sevens in their seeming inconsistency, in showing up in my groups and whatever it is, and that flightiness, and really tapping into, oh, okay, well, there are ways in which I struggle, as I just mentioned earlier, with like consistency myself, that there's some fear that like routine will take me down. Like I will literally become bored to death, like I can feel that in myself. And so connecting with that, then I can be less judgmental and much more have my heart open, because my heart is open to that part of me. It can be open to that part of you if you're a seven, And then for the eight, there's a fear of being harmed or controlled. And again, like, let's be clear, most eights don't feel fear consciously, but what they do is they armor up around that so much by being strong and forward in the world. But there's that little vulnerable part inside that's the reason the big guy, goes out and sort of fights with the world, is because you're not going to control me or harm me back here. And what's back here is actually preciously vulnerable. And so that bluster, like it can often be something that I historically was more judgmental of. Was like, why do you have to act so big? But, like kind of energy. And now it's like, oh, that makes total sense. Again, not just intellectually, but there's this, okay, how am I guarded in this way? How do I resist this through my armoring, being harmed or injured? And then I can see how, yeah, actually, threes have a lot in common with eights, in our sort of, we have a different kind of armor. We just like to think our armor is more tactful, so there's this like, oh, superiority around that, when it's really just another type, it's another brand of the same sort of basic fear, right? Like how we express it shows up differently. Okay, so last one is our nines, and nines have this fear of being disconnected or fragmented, also a fear of loss. And so perhaps historically, okay, I might still have some of these issues. I might have judgments as a three, of the nine of like, what do you get up and do something, right? Like to assert yourself, to show up, to engage in the world. But when I can empathetically like feel into that fear that my self-assertion will estrange me from my group or from others, that standing out by asserting myself, by taking action, that that feels like it will disconnect me from this sense of comfort, even though it's illusory comfort in being mixed up and mingled energetically with my environment, right? Because it's not like an authentic belonging, but it's like what I've got that I don't want to lose, right? Like comfort and merging as a proxy to authentic belonging, right? Like if I can really first understand that and then feel into the part of me that, if I'm really honest with myself, again, from my three perspective, I'm like, oh, so there are ways I haven't shown up because I thought that it would be disapproved of, right? That it would be unpopular even by people I care about, people whose opinions I care about. So it's actually not that far afield, so there are ways I can really feel into my desire to blend in order to belong, and my fear that if I stand out, that I won't get to be part of our sphere of affection and care. So, whew, even as I close this time with all the Enneagram types, I want to add one thing. We've talked about some of the more difficult things to empathize with, but I want to kind of add on, end on a high note, in the sense that, there is empathetic joy as well. And when we are empathetically open, because we're connected to our own spectrum of feelings and spectrum of humanity, that we actually also feel what Buddhists call mudita, empathetic joy. So it's very related to this idea that when we feel our feelings, when we make space to feel our feelings, we make space to feel the spectrum of feelings, right? Joy as well as struggle. Additionally, I want to say that empathy, this is a quote from Sofer, empathy allows us to be side by side with others' experiencing, maintaining both our own and their autonomy. If you sometimes become dysregulated by empathy, balance it with healthy differentiation. So it's really important also not just to talk about empathetic joy, but to talk about self-empathy. So another quote from Sofer, self-empathy brings love and understanding to your heart. When we are well, self-empathy appreciates happiness, savors joy, and deepens gratitude. When we struggle, it nourishes tenderness and self-compassion. Throughout, it brings warm, caring awareness to your emotions and needs. Yet we live in a world often devoid of true empathy. How often do you feel fully seen, understood, and accepted? Our economy pits us against each other, and the dominant social narrative fetishizes individualism, further isolating us from one another. Empathy allows us to stand in each other's shoes. How would our political and social landscape shift if we had more empathy for those of other classes, races, and political affiliations? I will add an Enneagram Types. Right? But wow, what a world. This is the world that I hope that we are co-creating together through our inner as well as our outer work. Only, to find at some level that our inner work and outer work are not actually two separate things, but they flow together, right? So in conclusion, I want to make sure you also know that empathy does not mean agreement. Sofer writes, we can strongly oppose another's actions or neutralize their influence without losing touch with their potential for goodness and their place in the human family. Easy example of this is that I volunteer in prisons, as some of you know, and it strikes me that this does not mean that I condone any of the crimes, right? But what I'm doing is opening a space where I'm sharing with these individuals to exactly do this, to not lose touch with their potential for goodness and their place in the human family, to be with them in such a way that helps them to remember that because I remember it with them, right? So I'll close with a poem by Nhien that was actually shared in our book journey by our Evolving Enneagram faculty, Macha Greenleaf-Maple. Thank you, Macha. Call me by my true names. This is just an excerpt of that poem. I am a mayfly metamorphosing on the surface of the river, and I am the bird that swoops down to swallow the mayfly. I am a frog swimming happily in the clear water of a pond, and I am the grass snake that silently feeds itself on the frog. I am the child in Uganda, all skin and bones, my legs as thin as bamboo sticks, and I am the arms merchant selling deadly weapons to Uganda. I am the 12-year-old girl, refugee on a small boat, who throws herself into the ocean after being raped by a sea pirate, and I am also the pirate, my heart not yet capable of seeing and loving. Indeed, empathy invites us to hold our shared humanity, even when the other person isn't necessarily aware of that humanity in his or her or themselves. And so not at the expense of holding space for our own, but making sure that we are including ourselves in that empathetic gaze, right? So with that, have a great summer, those of you in our Contemplative Practices and the Enneagram groups. And I look forward to seeing you in the fall. And I will be continuing these Sunday talks every Sunday. So maybe I'll get to see you via comments in the YouTube posts. For those of you, again, who are not yet in a CPE group, there are also Sunday cohorts. You can get on evolvingenneagram.com and check out our summer cohorts. As of today, there's like one space left, I think, in each of the groups. So maybe that space was meant for you. Namaste.